Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this November CEDIL webinar on exploring the transferability of mid-range theories, recontextualizing an evidence portal. My name is Marcella Vignelli, and I'm Research Fellow with the Center of Excellence for Development, Impact and Learning. I'm here to introduce the speakers and to go through a few housekeeping rules before I hand over to John today. So CEDIL, which as I said stands for the Center of Excellence for Development, Impact and Learning, is a project funded through UK aid with money from the British people. Today we have the pleasure to co-host the seminar with the Education Endowment Foundation. And we have three speakers, Jonathan Kay, Emma Dobson, and Melaine Nsaikila. John will also be chairing the session for you, and he will be doing a little bit more detailed introduction of himself and the other two panelists. My job here is to just remind all of you of a few housekeeping issues. First and foremost, please write any questions that you have and that come up throughout the session in the Q&A function, not in the chat box. And this will be monitored both by myself and Susie Bourdet at CEDIL and by the list. Secondly, the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available after the event in about a week's time on CEDIL's website. We also wish to ask you to please complete the post-webinar survey, which you should be redirected to at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, welcome again to this session, and John, over to you.
Thanks. And first, just by way of introduction, so we're going to talk today about a project that we've been running, kindly funded by CEDIL, that revolves around trying to transfer an evidence portal from the English context or to the Chad Basin, so focusing on Niger, Nigeria, Chad and Cameroon. And to give a bit of context about the work that the Education Endowment Foundation does, and I'm head of evidence synthesis at the EEF, we are the What Work Centre for Education in England. And our aim is to close the attainment gap between pupils from socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds and their more affluent peers, primarily through the use of high quality evidence. And we go about that mission using three main activities. So evidence generation, and we were very lucky in that we were funded with a large endowment from government, which allows us to be independent, but also allows us to run randomized control trials. So we're the biggest funder of randomized control trials in the English education system. And we also have funded a number of global trials to examine the impact of approaches internationally. The second pillar of activity that we do, and the one that we'll talk about most extensively today, is about evidence synthesis. So bringing together the evidence, summarising it, doing systematic reviews, doing meta-analyses, and then making that evidence really accessible in guidance and in the evidence portal, which I'll move on to discuss. And then finally, and also linked to the project today, evidence dissemination. So that's not just letting the research sit on a website, but being involved in really active dissemination activities with the aim that the research actually changes the behaviour of the people accessing it. In the English system, we have a network of research schools that we fund to directly disseminate research school to school. And across many of our global partners, we have really active dissemination methods, be that through policymakers or in more autonomous systems directly to teachers, either through teacher training or through other active teacher to teacher or researcher to teacher dissemination methods. But the main thing that the project that CEDIL has funded focuses on is our evidence portal. So we have a very well used in the English system and beginning to be well used internationally evidence portal known as the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. And by way of introduction, what I'm going to do is just share the screen so that people can see what I'm talking about when we're referring to this evidence portal. because it's all very well having a long session on the translation of evidence portal. If you're not aware of what it is, that would be a bit tricky and lacking in context. So the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which you can hopefully see on the screen now, is essentially an evidence portal that summarises meta-analyses for 30 different educational approaches that people might use. And these aren't intervention level meta-analyses. They take place at the level of approaches. So something near to mid-range theories, and we'll get into in a bit how many of these actually are mid-range theories. But rather than being specific interventions, like a specific feedback approach, say embedding formative assessment, it summarises the evidence more generally for the effectiveness of feedback or the effectiveness of homework. Another good example might be something like metacognitive approaches. So that's where learners learn to moderate and regulate their own learning through metacognition. And what the evidence portal aims to do for teachers is summarise the evidence in three really broad and accessible categories. So how much it costs, how secure the evidence is, so both the quality of the studies and the quantity of studies in any given evidence base, and also the overall impact, which we communicate in months progress. And this is derived from an effect size and then converted into the number of months progress that pupils make over the course of a 12-month period in comparison with pupils that haven't received the intervention. And the months progress measure is one of the key, I guess, simplifications to make that evidence really accessible and usable by practitioners or policymakers. But we encourage people not just to stay on the homepage. This is a very nice poster that summarises about 2,600 studies in total. But when you click on any of the strands, we give a lot more information on what's actually going on behind this. So defining the approach, giving a list of some of the key findings from the meta-analysis, an overall description of how effective the approach tends to be, and then really importantly, a little bit about what sits behind those big averages. So these are derived from moderator analysis that are conducted as part of the meta-analyses. And it tries to give an indication of where there are differential impacts, be that by age, by subject, by different pedagogical approaches. So here we have a slightly smaller effect than the average when feedback is delivered using digital technology. We also have a key focus on closing the disadvantage gap, and we provide summaries of individual approaches that might sit behind the broader approach. So written feedback and oral feedback both sit within the more general approach of feedback overall. Then we give lots of information on implementation. So what are the ways that schools, what are the necessary components, I guess, of the mid-range theory to be implemented in any particular setting. And then some information about cost and a really transparent summary about the security of the evidence. So the number of studies and also the threats to validity that those studies have. So really keen to highlight if there are a small number of randomized controlled trials. The searches that we run does include other designs as long as there is a comparison group, so includes quasi-experimental designs. But we want to be really transparent about when things are losing padlocks overall and when there are risks in terms of the overall evidence base. And then we flag to other resources and other kind of randomized controlled trials that the EF funded. And what we also do is we provide a technical appendix. So if you click through, you can see all the underlying studies. You can click through on any particular study and get access to the source, be able to click through. And so you get a really good kind of accessible summary of both what the findings are, but also what the underlying studies are for the evidence base. And so that's the key principle behind this evidence portal. It's been really, really well used in the English education system. So we do yearly surveys that compares take up and use. We obviously have our web diagnostics as well, and we get over 1 million page hits each year. And about 70% of school leaders in England currently say that they access the Teaching and Learning Toolkit when making their decisions. So it's an incredibly high take-up of an evidence portal. We also track the actual use. So we look at school spending statements to see how many are referencing the toolkit directly when making decisions over funding. And at this point, that's around 20% are explicitly referencing the toolkit when they're making their funding decisions. So not just access, but also use of the resource. And the popularity and take-up of the toolkit within the English system has encouraged a number of jurisdictions to think about how they translate the evidence to their jurisdiction. So it is a global summary of evidence. We don't have any geographical search criteria. We don't exclude studies from any particular region. We do analyse to see if there are geographical differences in impact. But overall, it's a global summary of evidence. And so a number of partners have begun translating the toolkit for their context. So there's a version of the toolkit that is in Australia that includes the global summaries and the global impacts, but also includes local evidence searches for contextual details to identify whether the evidence is corroborated or contradicted by any studies that have happened in Australasian settings. And more recently, and really hearteningly, there's been much more take-up due to the impact of COVID, which is obviously a massive consideration at the moment in terms of how we have a successful recovery to the impacts of school closures across a number of different countries. And so the Dutch education system, alongside their very generous funding package to schools, encourages all schools to access a menu of different interventions, which is derived from the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. So I mean, my Dutch is probably less good than others on the call, but these are summaries and translations of the findings of the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, talking about the evidence security, talking about the month's progress, and again, talking about the costs, all derived from the same global searches of the evidence base. Which brings us to the projects that we're talking about today. So lots of the contexts that we've translated the toolkit for have been broadly similar. So the Australian education system is another high-income system, another fairly autonomous school system. There are some differences in that there's a federal education system, but broadly there's more similarities than differences. But the next recontextualisation with our partners in eBASE Africa was about contextualising this resource and seeing if this resource could be useful for teachers in the Chad Basin. And as part of that, we didn't want to just run rapid searches. What we wanted to do was a much more comprehensive attempt to understand whether the toolkit actually could be recontextualised and whether all of the strands were relevant, whether there were a particular subset of strands that were relevant, or whether potentially none of the strands were relevant. And so the key research questions that we went into this project were, firstly, are these coherent mid-range theories? Things like metacognition and feedback that go through the teacher to the pupil might be things that might have a good chance of transfer because it's a very direct interaction between teacher and pupil. It's less likely to be moderated by the kind of contextual barriers. Certain topics might be much more likely to not be transferable. Certain topics might not even be possible in the context. And so one of the things that Melaine's going to talk about is the efforts to engage stakeholders and understand which of these topics actually could be implemented in a particular setting. The next challenge that we faced was ensuring that we had all of the relevant evidence in our database, because while we don't have any geographic inclusion or exclusion criteria, we're aware that there's a large amount of grey literature that has happened in development context that might not have been picked up by original searches. So trying to make sure we fill in the gaps that might be missing. And then finally, we're aware that there are a number of topics that might be relevant that aren't included in the toolkit because it was developed for an English context. So types of interventions, types of theories, types of approaches that should be included if an evidence portal is going to be relevant for the Chad Basin. And so that formed another key part of this project. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Melaine and to Emma to talk about some of the parts of the project and talk about some of the findings that we've had as we've gone through this process to try and recontextualise the Teaching and Learning Toolkit for the Chad Basin. And so first off, I'll hand over to Melaine, who's going to talk us through the work that eBASE have been doing and to talk through particularly the elements of transferability that his team have explored and the engagement with stakeholders. So Melaine, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. So I'll be talking on exploring the transferability of mid-range theories through recontextualization, and particularly on the eBASE Teaching and Learning Toolkit experience. As Jonathan has already mentioned, the evidence portal is actually a website that presents research evidence in a form accessible to policymakers as well as practitioners. So the eBASE Teaching and Learning Toolkit is an evidence portal recontextualized from the Global Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which Jonathan already showcased, through a rigorous replicable process, and it summarizes research evidence in the Lake Chad Basin in particular and Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole of numerous educational interventions grouped across themes, hereby referred to as strands. The Lake Chad Basin actually ranks very low globally and even locally in terms of educational attainment, the four main countries of the Lake Chad Basin. And these efforts at improving educational attainment is further complicated by conflicts as well as pandemics. COVID-19 is an example, but we have cholera outbreaks every now and then. And there are as well natural disasters that actually hamper efforts at improving attainment. So looking beyond the Lake Chad Basin, principally the focus was the Lake Chad Basin, but when we zoomed in with initial searches, systematic searches for the four main countries of the Lake Chad Basin, we realized that there was very little in terms of research output coming from these countries: Cameroon, Niger, Chad, and Nigeria. The second consideration was the fact that the entire continent of Africa accounts just for about 3.6% of global research output, and focusing only on a few four countries might not actually reflect the situation on the continent, given that there is some level of homogeneity across the problems that these countries are facing in different sectors, education one of those sectors. The final consideration was the fact that some efforts have been made at educational improvement and improving educational attainment in some countries of East Africa, as well as Southern Africa, as well as in Far West Africa, that could be replicated within the Lake Chad Basin. So our consideration to go look at not only the Lake Chad Basin, but looking beyond the Lake Chad Basin at Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. So just a brief summary, we can actually see global research output across different regions of the world, and you can actually notice that Africa ranks very low, right down there in terms of total scholar research output. And if we zoom in only on the Lake Chad Basin, we find that the majority of the research within the region is coming from Nigeria. Cameroon coming second, but not doing very well, and Chad and Niger doing very badly, if I may. Recontextualizing the toolkit. So the actual process of recontextualization involves and was mainly guided by stakeholder sessions. So while eBASE held a good number of stakeholder sessions, we could group these stakeholder sessions into three main categories. The first session, which came at the beginning of the project, was a session for prioritization of the strands based on local needs. Not prioritization necessarily in terms of importance, but prioritization in terms of need and relevance on the ground. So contextual need and relevance played a key role in the decision of which the strands should feature in the recontextualization toolkit. So after this stakeholder session, It was then decided that strands such as school uniform, setting or streaming or teaching assistant kept aside, at least for the moment, and focus on the remaining strands. The second the second stakeholder session actually focused on additional strands. What are those key elements? What are those topical issues that are that should be addressed in schools but are not necessarily found within the global toolkit? Hence, no way for recontextualization per se at first sight. So we then this stakeholder session actually most of it conducted in the north. There were elements of menstrual hygiene management being highlighted as a key issue that actually affects educational attainment of girls. There was the aspect of corporal punishment. Corporal punishment, as in most parts of the world, is banned in Cameroon, but there is hardly any evidence informed strategy being pushed out there by policymakers for teachers and practitioners to use in terms to deal with issues, behavioral issues within schools. There was the issue of cash transfers. Many children are actually staying back home and not going to school because their parents or guardians actually lack the finances or the means to send them to school. So we're looking at to what extent cash transfers actually go to actually improve educational attainment. And finally, during this stakeholder session, they also talked of adult education, looking at strands like parental engagement as well as homework. It is necessary that those who are at home, parents particularly or guardians, should be educated to a given level in order to be able to engage their children or help them back at home with whatever assignment they've come with from school. So adult education was being proposed because most of the stakeholders and participants in this session said it's actually impossible for a parent who is illiterate to be able to help the children back at home. And finally, there were other stakeholder sessions for data extraction for the individual interventions across all strands. And the essence for this was actually to develop a transferability model. And this session mainly focused on looking at individual interventions and deciding upon the relevance, costing that intervention per child, looking at the complexity of the intervention as well as the transferability of intervention. Summarizing the research evidence. After most of these stakeholder sessions, particularly the first stakeholder session, there was back and forth with respect to training on AP Reviewer, particularly for the new strands that were decided upon: menstrual hygiene management, corporal punishment, as well as cash transfers, conducting systematic reviews for this. So there was training on the use of AP Reviewer, as well as conducting systematic searches across various databases. And this was done in collaboration with EEF, as well as researchers and partners at at Durham University. We then partitioned these strands among team members to conduct random searching and summarizing the research evidence. And based on the diversity of strategies, most eBASE staff, most individuals working on the project actually came up. We were then able to harmonize and come up with a template to report, a template that will be a harmonious template to report all the evidence summaries across all the strands, the 31 strands that were decided upon. Detailed search strategies were then written for all strands, as well as search strings created. And then there was the deployment of these search strings across all strands. Deployment of these search strings across the various databases, and then the selection of the exportation of the results, screening by title and abstract, and finally summarizing the research evidence for the relevant papers that were found relevant to each strand. In addition to this, a technical file for summarizing the searching, screening, and summarization process was also developed. With respect to impact, security, and cost of the evidence, which John already touched on, given that these were rapid reviews, it was actually very difficult to come up with the impact, but we were able to give brief description of the direction of majority of the evidence within each strand. For security of the strand locally, of the local evidence, we're able to state clearly the types of studies, were they randomized trials, were they quasi-experimental studies, were they just observational studies, or just literature reviews. We're able to state that clearly what the types of studies in each of these strands. And finally, we had a more robust process with respect to costing, as we were able to itemize the different elements required for the implementation of each strand, and then average the minimum wage of the region at purchasing power parity, and then come up with a classification of how a cost classification across the different strands, from very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. Totally, across all strands, we had over 24 quasi-experimental studies. There were a total of about 15 randomized controlled trials and many other observational studies. The strands with the least amount of evidence so far after the searching were arts participation, block scheduling, homework primary, outdoor learning, and summer schools. And particularly for homework primary and summer schools, these are activities that are prevalent within our context, homework and summer schools, but there's hardly any evidence in relation to the extent to which these strategies actually impact educational attainment. So the way forward, I do think more systematic reviews and randomized trials should be conducted. For current systematic reviews, we do have the menstrual hygiene management systematic review that is ongoing and will soon be rounded up. There is that for corporal punishment, as well as that for cash transfers. There is also, EEF has also been gracious to commission a pilot study on randomized, a pilot study for menstrual hygiene management. And that pilot study will actually inform whether it is feasible to scale up to a full randomized trial. To keep the toolkit alive and active and valid, I do think quarterly or biannual updates of the eBASE Teaching and Learning Toolkit should be done. And this should be done by ensuring that the searching continue on a quarterly or biannual basis to update the evidence summaries with new evidence that pop up. And invest in other byproducts like the transferability tool, which I do think the database project already speaks to that, as it will provide the necessary data to expand what we already have for the transferability tool, enable the model to learn better and be a better predictor of the transferability of interventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Melaine. I'm just taking over from John, who had a bit of a technology glitch and a fire alarm. Emma, over to you. Would you like to start by introducing yourself? Thank you very much.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Emma Dobson and I'm a researcher at Durham University School of Education. As Jonathan said at the start of this, we really weren't sure to what extent the existing toolkit, the EEF toolkit, contained literature and research studies from low middle income settings. So when we came to kind of tackle this question of transferability, we really weren't sure to what extent we could actually kind of assist these discussions around transfer, and to what extent our existing evidence database did contain relevant research. So I had the perhaps unfortunate job of being the person to check to what extent the portal did include research from LMIC countries. So I'm going to share with you now some of my findings from undertaking those searches. So I'm going to talk briefly about what we mean by mid-range theory, because it is quite a contested term, and there are very various different labels that are used to kind of explain what that can mean. So I'm going to touch on what we mean by that setting, and we're also going to talk a little bit about the toolkit in its current form. So to what extent do we actually use mid-range theory, or how easy is it to perhaps find the mid-range theory within the toolkit? And also talk a little bit about, as a process of conducting those searches within the toolkit, we started to reach out to other evidence portals to perhaps try and expand or broaden our current evidence base and our findings from that process. And then also just touch on the conduct of some of those reviews that Melaine was speaking about. So in particular, the cash transfer review, and what I think the implications of those findings are for our development and understanding of mid-range theory. So in all, this project, I suppose, had kind of 4 key areas of action. We tackled existing strands in the EEF toolkit first. So as I said, we kind of looked at the prevalence of LMIC studies within the toolkit. And we also looked to see whether some of our studies or kind of our strands were being reflected in other databases. So there I'm talking about the throgh development evidence portal. We wanted to see if there were kind of any overlaps. So were we picking up on development research? And in turn, if we had missed any kind of important studies, were there large numbers of perhaps, for example, homework interventions conducted in LMIC settings that our current searches weren't finding, but were present in other databases? And also whether there were completely different themes that we weren't capturing within the toolkit, but were popular interventions in other settings that we now perhaps need to start thinking about including. And then, as Melaine has been speaking about, we also supported this development of new strands for the eBASE toolkit, and that was through doing reviews of cash transfers, menstrual hygiene, and then later corporal punishment. So just to start, mid-range theory, as I said, it's a really contested term. Generally, given that it's referred to as mid-range, although some people do say mid-level, there is an idea of scope there. And that idea is generally that, from the diagram on the side, we're not really talking about high-level generalized theory. So for example, social learning theory. And we're not talking about specific theories that would apply to programs in themselves, or perhaps named programs or specific approaches within an intervention style. We are talking kind of about a general intervention. So this is actually my model, so please don't ever quote it to anyone, because they would just tell you you're talking absolute nonsense. But as I was the person who was kind of trying to seek out these mid-range theories, this was my understanding of it. So in this diagram, we kind of have this first outer level of the theory, which is generalizable. And as I gave that example, it probably would be something like social learning theory. And you can see by the people icons within the box, there are 4 people icons there to kind of say this theory would be able to apply widely. Then in the next level down, we have this idea of mid-range theory. So the example that I would give there, and this is purely because I did my PhD on peer education, would be peer education. So of course, we can apply that type of intervention various ways, different contexts, different delivery styles, different pedagogic strategies. So it is quite wide ranging, but it's not as generalizable as kind of this idea of like large social learning theory. So the number of people icons with that is smaller. And then we get more and more specific. So for example, program theory, that would be the specific application within that intervention. And then all the way down to a project theory, which would be particular settings with kind of very unique populations. Nested within each of these levels of theories, I would argue, as is my understanding of mid-range theory, you would have these CMO configurations, and that stands for context plus a mechanism will give you an outcome. So my understanding of mid-range theory would be, I would expect to be able to outline in what contexts, with what mechanisms will lead to the production of these outcomes for people and pupils. So for example, if you would take homework, there are many different ways that we could apply a homework intervention. So I would argue it's probably a mid-range theory. But within that, what contexts, what mechanisms will lead to which outcomes? As I said, I know that the terminology surrounding this is highly variable, and some people would say to me, well, you're just outlining a program theory there. I would say kind of program theory or theory of change would include kind of more detailed description of what potential outcomes could be that you kind of can't account for in a simple formula. So for example, if we think about cash transfers, if you were arguing that the outcome would be an increase in school attendance, one of the variables that would be then included in that theory would be the potential need to employ more teachers to deal with the increase in teachers there. So it's not a direct influence perhaps on that kind of formulaic process of how we get to an outcome, but it would be something that you'd have to consider within the wider theory. So as I said, I had the job of examining to what extent the EEF toolkit was already kind of gauging in these theory formulation processes and how transferable those theories could be. So in this example, I was looking at one-to-one tuition. Now, as I said, based on my understanding, that would be a mid-level theory. It is easier since we relaunched the toolkit, because we're actually looking at a new version of the toolkit that John shared with you. We have been able to kind of identify via meta-analysis what contexts may produce larger effects on outcomes, and also along that side, what mechanisms. So for example, if there are variations in delivery in one-to-one tuition, whether that's with perhaps a teacher or a peer or a teaching assistant, we're able to kind of track whether those changes in delivery impact outcomes. However, just a general, I suppose, criticism of educational research is it can sometimes be very hard to work out what those causal processes are, particularly when we come down to the individual studies. It's rare that researchers will actually kind of give a comprehensive overview of which part of the theory they're trying to engage with and trying to test. And so that kind of makes it very difficult for us when we look at the toolkit to sometimes write those sections where we talk about how teachers should implement these in schools, because it can still be quite unclear to us what context and what mechanisms are involved in some of those processes. It also meant that when we talk about transfer to different contexts, we needed to make sure that we had enough heterogeneity within the research studies that we could start to look at things like differences in country of origin. So is there a big change in outcome if the country is changed, or if the region is changed, or if we look at perhaps socioeconomic status of a country? Do we find that there are kind of social or contextual, cultural factors that may be driving these changes? And the way to do that really was to examine to what extent existing studies in the toolkit were covering a range of different settings. What I found, first of all, was that actually we had 53 different countries that were kind of included in the toolkit overall. However, it was massively dominated by studies from the US. So that automatically raises questions about how transferable these research findings can be. When you look at the countries where the majority of our research is being conducted, it's the USA, followed by the UK, Canada. So very kind of westernized settings, all with similar-ish kinds of education systems. So we weren't fully confident that just in a general sense, we could kind of wholesalely pick up the toolkit findings as they've been represented in England and just use them elsewhere. And that is when we felt it was very important for eBASE to kind of conduct their own localized searches and engage in those stakeholder discussions to make sure that their toolkit was relevant for their setting. I also found that when I went a little bit further than just looking at country and did look at setting in terms of like continent and World Bank classification, so different regions, what we found was the majority of research, of course, given the US kind of prevalence, was being conducted in kind of North America and Europe. And countries and settings, for example, like in sub-Saharan Africa, they were the least prevalent within the toolkits. There was a complete lack of literature. And that could be due to a number of reasons, so publication bias just generally in academia, as Melaine touched on, 3.6% of published studies being conducted in Africa. So of course, we are going to find less studies in that setting. Also with our review inclusion criteria, so we focus on attainment. And I would say that given the kind of, again, contextual influences in the region of sub-Saharan Africa, so things like pandemics, outbreaks of violence, natural disasters, that does mean that the emphasis there tends to be on increasing attendance rather than attainment. So we tend to exclude a lot of studies who then perhaps don't report on attainment, but that's because their focus is actually on a different kind of educational outcome. And also just access to grey literature can also be very tricky to identify which portals we need to be searching, because they're not always included in the more kind of automatic searches that you can conduct via the big databases online. So this is just to compare kind of the yellow lines. I know it's quite a small graph, but the yellow lines are research from high income countries using the World Bank classification. The little orange bars are low income countries. So you can see that there are some areas of the toolkit where we do have maybe a larger prevalence of low-income country research. So for example, collaborative learning and individualized instruction. However, there are the other areas where we have no research at all from low-income countries. So school uniform, outdoor adventure learning, summer schools. And again, that reflects the searches that eBASE had conducted, where they also were struggling to find research that had been conducted in that setting. The way to resolve this, we felt, was to actually look at a development database and see to what extent the research held within the throgh education database was similar to ours, or whether we had kind of missed some important parts of literature. What we did is we took any review that was of an educational intervention and we lifted individual citations from that review. And we also took references from single studies in the throgh database. We imported them into Epi Reviewer, which is an online reviewing software, and then we were able to screen studies based on our inclusion criteria that we would use for the toolkit. So we could work out which of the studies contained within the throgh database could actually be included in our toolkit, which of those were already included and which weren't. So you can see there at the bottom, we had 8 studies that were included in the toolkit with 116 that appear to be relevant for a toolkit strand. So studies of things like peer learning, collaborative learning, homework, where they appear that they could be included, but they're currently not in the toolkit. So there's a potential there that we have missed that literature. The exciting number for me is actually the 274 studies that met our inclusion criteria, but they currently examine an intervention that we don't include in the toolkit, because that means there's a great possibility for us to start including new interventions and new strands in the toolkit based on this new research. If we return to this graphic of low-income, high-income country split in the toolkit, this is how it looks currently. If we then move to include those studies that we found in the throgh database, that is represented by now those blue bars. So you can see for a strand, for example, like school uniform or peer tutoring, reading comprehension, those numbers are jumping up slightly. So we would actually have a much larger percentage of studies from low-income settings, and that then may help us in making those judgments around transferability. It's also very useful to identify areas where there are still no studies conducted. So for example, aspiration interventions is one area we currently find that research, both kind of from our side and from the development portals, appears to be lacking. And that's a great opportunity, obviously, for us to perhaps propose future interventions. And again, this graphic just shows how our geographical range would expand if we included those studies. So currently, as I said, the darker yellow you can see is that prevalence from the US. There aren't many studies from Africa or South America. If you add in those throgh studies, this does change slightly. So now we have much more studies conducted in Africa and in South America. This last part of the presentation is just going to touch on the review that we did of cash transfers and how I think using meta-analysis when we conduct these reviews would be helpful in expanding our current understanding of mid-range theory. So we conducted a cash transfer review where we found existing reviews of cash transfer studies, and again, we lifted those individual references. And we also did comprehensive searches. The eBASE team conducted searches across many different platforms to find relevant studies on cash transfers. We combined those two approaches to conduct a review of cash transfer studies. Overall, 26 studies were included in the meta-analysis. There were a potential 100 studies, but as I touched on earlier, those studies tend to report on other outcomes that we currently don't focus on. So outcomes could be things like absenteeism or dropout. So they currently aren't included. So there is potential again there for us to expand our evidence base if we started to consider these alternative outcomes. Generally, what we found, however, from running a meta-analysis was that the impact of cash transfers on attainment was quite low, which does echo the findings of other reviews and meta-analyses on this area. We didn't find positive effects for maths or science. They were largely focused on language. And the majority of studies were conducted in LMIC countries. Obviously, these programs are most relevant in those settings, particularly in South America and Africa. However, there were a few studies in the US, and one in particular from the UK, which was based on educational maintenance allowance, which was a scheme that has stopped now, but would give students money to attend higher education. And that just shows how there is some transfer in these interventions, but perhaps they go by different terms and different labels. And again, that is something for us to consider when we search for these interventions in future. I've touched on this issue already, this idea that we focused obviously on attainment, but the main kind of hoped for outcome of cash transfer interventions is this idea of attendance. So we also did look at increase in attendance. And again, this was quite small. Now, my understanding of mid-range theory actually, as I said, came from my PhD, but I was really excited because in 2020, CEDL actually published a methods brief where they were looking at the use of this mid-level theory to help improve program evaluation and design. And they produced this diagram. It's quite complex, but it kind of encompasses all the different ways in which we would expect a cash transfer intervention to work. So what are the key components? What do we think the modifiers are? What do we think these outcomes are? Where are kind of potential areas where the intervention chain could break down and kind of lead to undesirable outcomes or no outcome at all? So I love this. I thought it was brilliant because, as I said, I like the idea of kind of theory influencing interventions, but it can be a little bit hard to read and understand, particularly because we don't know from this diagram the extent to which kind of the influencing variables, we don't understand to what extent they exert influence on observed outcomes. And are outcomes kind of comprehensive across the board, or do they vary by different populations? And that is where I think doing meta-analysis and kind of particularly engaging in moderator analysis is particularly helpful, because we should be able to then actually say or identify which contexts may influence outcomes, to what effect. So it could be that actually some of these kind of influencing variables actually would lead to a negative effect. So how can we tell? Perhaps we need to kind of color code them or kind of find a different way of representing these. And that should hopefully lead to more precise predictions of transferability, but also allow us to test interventions. So if moderator analysis suggests that one of these variables produces a much larger effect, then in later interventions, we already have kind of a key, perhaps different group or a different arm of the experiment, which we could then focus on to test whether that theory is actually working as expected. So, for example, we found through our analysis that health conditions, actually attaching a health condition to a cash transfer would lead to a greater attainment effect. So, we could then obviously use that moderator analysis to modify this diagram and say, well, actually, at the moment, we're kind of talking about education conditions, so such as kind of, you must prove that you've enrolled in a school. We've identified that as an important factor. Well, actually, another important factor is attaching a health condition, such as attendance to a clinic, and we could update that diagram accordingly. Another example, as I said briefly earlier, would be about color coding. So we found that if you attach conditions to a transfer, it is much more likely to lead to a bigger effect. So perhaps we could change the color of that to green to show that that is one variable that we can now kind of say, yes, that does have a positive influence. It's not just a suggested influence. I have no idea how we would actually represent that. So for all my talk of kind of color coding and perhaps doing things by size, when I actually came to playing around with how to visually represent it, it was incredibly difficult. But again, I think that is great potential for us to work perhaps with SEDL and with eBASE in future to work out how we kind of represent the different kind of weight that these different conditions can give and can lend to the influence of the intervention outcome. But here, for example, I've tried. So you can see based on our kind of meta-analysis that cash transfers, generally the impact for secondary schools is smaller than the impact would be for primary schools. So the +1 refers to +1 month's attainment compared to in primary school. So cash transfers given to students who would fall within that kind of 5 to 11 age year gap, the increase in attainment seems to be larger, double. So I've kind of tried to indicate that with sizes. Similarly, in terms of the mechanism, unconditional cash transfers do have a small effect, but when we attach those conditions, the effect is larger. So I've tried to represent that as well. And then finally for outcomes, so to give some indication of, it's not just an improvement overall, the improvement appears to be specifically in language. So currently there is unknown about kind of maths and science, mainly because studies didn't focus on those. So we can't really give an indication. So they would then be grayed out. As I said, it's a work in progress because it would be extremely difficult to represent and to visualize, mainly because the kind of array of different contexts and an array of different kind of variables that can influence those interventions, they are very complex, they are numerous, as represented in that kind of SEDL methods diagram. But I think it would be a really interesting thing to work on in the future. And that's me done.
Thanks, Emma. That was really great. So now we're going to move to the panel session. Apologies, I'm not sure, I might keep my video off actually, because during those presentations, my office building was evacuated. So I'm now sat outside the Tate Britain and making use of their free Wi-Fi. So if any of the audio comes off as a bit disrupted, then please let me know. But Emma and Melaine, please keep your videos on so people have something to look at. So we'll now move into a panel session. Please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box. But just to start us off, Melaine and Emma, just thinking through the project and thinking through the kind of various bits of activity that you've described, what are your reflections on those research questions? So reflecting on the project as a whole, do you think that the pedagogical evidence from one context can be useful to a teacher or a policymaker in another context?
Okay, let me go first. Yes, I do think it can be relevant to a teacher in another context, but there are certain other aspects that are contextually different that must be taken into consideration before taking that step in order to use research evidence or pedagogical evidence from one side, from one maybe from a high income country to another to a low income country. And this actually speaks directly to what we did for the transferability tool, because we're not only looking at the interventions, we're looking at the relevance of that intervention in dealing with a particular problem that we are facing within schools. And these problems were being, this process actually involved both policymakers, teachers, practitioners, the parents, as well as the students, speaking to issues that they face in school and how each of these interventions can actually come in to deal with those. It looked at the complexity because for each intervention, we actually looked at the strategy used in implementing, in deploying that particular intervention. How complex is the deployment of that intervention? And is there the local capacity? Do we have existing locally the capacity to deploy such an intervention? And for some, you would find or hear policymakers say that this thing is impossible. But when we go detailedly and maybe unpack some of the things that are actually needed for the deployment of a particular intervention, they then come to terms with the fact that, hey, this could be possible within our setting. That's for complexity. Then cost. An intervention could be relevant, it could be less complex, or we could, to an extent, deal with the complexity, but it's too costly to be actually implemented within our setting. So those are some of the things that actually go in to predict the transferability of intervention from one context to the other. And it actually provides an opportunity to go back into the model, the different steps of the model, and say, okay, this intervention is actually relevant, but the main issue we are finding with respect to the implementation of this intervention is the cost. How do we generate the necessary resources, financial resources, or it could be complexity. How do we generate the necessary human power to be able to implement this intervention? That's where aspects of incorporating some of the different strategies in teacher training colleges actually came up. So I do think these are some of the things that might be taken into consideration when thinking about moving pedagogical evidence from one sector, from one income area to the next. I don't know if Emma has something to say.
Oh, I mean, I completely agree, especially regarding costs. So one thing that was really difficult for me when I was trying to look at the cash transfer research was, in some countries, the cash transfer appeared relatively small, but if you looked at that in relation, obviously, to kind of average household income, it was relatively large. So trying to kind of compare success when you're looking at settings which are so different, it can be very difficult. So yes, there is value in transfer, but we have to be very mindful of kind of where we're trying to transfer to and what the differences are. And one thing that I think is particularly important as well is this idea of different populations, because I think it's hard for anyone to kind of imagine a different population outside of the setting in which they already work. So a lot of my work is actually in sex education. And I think there is a danger when we present findings from meta-analysis and randomized control trials that we do just kind of almost overgeneralize. And I should be careful what I'm saying, because obviously I work for the EF, we love trials. But sometimes we then use those findings and apply them to populations without actually considering what the kind of context is. So for example, we were teaching at a local school in London. We had a sex education program that was very successful across the board. One school, it just did not go well at all. We couldn't understand what was happening. And it was because we had male members of staff trying to deliver sex education lessons to, they were female only classes of Islamic students. And the students turned around and said, well, we hated this, and we were saying, well, other students loved it. It was great. And they said, no, we hated it. We wouldn't talk to a man about these issues. And we hadn't even considered that. So there are, really important considerations that, yes, we can transfer these interventions across borders and boundaries, but we do need to have a very good understanding of things like context and cost and how they're mediated by the environment in which we work.
Absolutely.
Thanks both, really, really useful. And then thinking through in terms of transferability to the next step. So we have a very context-specific way of disseminating the toolkit in the English education system. But Melaine, could you tell us a little bit about eBASE's plans for disseminating the evidence portal once it launches in the Chad Basin?
Okay, I'll simply throw in some of the plans we have, even though we haven't completely decided on the general strategy. So first, engagement with the Ministry of Basic Education as well as secondary education, because there are certain aspects that we do think should be incorporated within the teacher training, in teacher training colleges, in the curriculum of teacher training colleges, that will quickly facilitate the deployment of some of these. We're living in a context of conflict, for example, social and emotional training, and imbibing teachers with strategies to deal with students who are distressed or have witnessed certain conditions as a result, certain situations as a result of war, is very, very necessary. That's an aspect that I do think is not incorporated within teacher training, at least generally. It's particular for counselors. The second thing is coming up with posters and guidance notes that could be directly used by practitioners on the field. That's one way that we are planning to deal with posters and guidance notes, as well as on the site training with teachers and students, both at the community level, on how on the best practices with which they can use to deploy or to use some of this evidence that we have been able to put together. So I do think that's just basically a summary of what we have in mind moving forward. But of course, this will also be expanded moving forward to better deal with the different situations that we have on the ground.
Thanks, that's great. And that actually touches on one of the questions we've had in the chat, which is about whether you've considered ways of communicating to groups that might be illiterate or even just less research literate than other groups.
Absolutely, yes. And particularly for dissemination, we also have a strategy at eBASE, Evidence Story Day, which is taking scientific evidence and using locally styled stories to actually tell or to teach these different best practices. And that has been able to work for a wide range of different issues. Menstrual hygiene, we've had Evidence Story Day on menstrual hygiene management. And it coins the story in such a way that is culturally accepted, and you are not seen as throwing out some sort of a taboo or something that is totally alienated from the population. So local storytelling is actually another strategy that we will use and are already using in different aspects of the work that eBASE is doing to actually translate this evidence locally.
That's great. And another question from the chat, which I think, Emma, your presentation touched on a bit, is how the mid-range theory of change relates to the wider theories of change, either for interventions or programs.
So it's tricky because all the terms are kind of used synonymously, but generally the way I would see it is kind of this mid-range theory is kind of the core. What are kind of the core components that are required? And also, as I said, if there are kind of key mediating or influencing variables, to what extent are they exerting influence and in what direction is that influence? In cash transfers, we were quite fortunate in that our analysis only showed positive change. There are obviously some educational interventions where some mediating variables could either give a null change or the opposite and could actually kind of hinder or delay progress. So for me, that is the importance of that kind of mid-range theory. It sits at the center. Then in kind of the broader kind of program theory, as represented in that unsettled diagram, I think you would then kind of consider factors that may exert influence, but also kind of, I suppose, exist in the kind of environment in which the intervention is being deployed. So as I said, the example of kind of things like if you're going to increase student numbers, is the context in which you're working ready to also have to hire teachers? So do they have the funds available? Are there trained teachers available? Or do they now have to consider kind of acquiring funds from somewhere, perhaps launching teacher training programs? Can they actually deal with lost workforce? So yes, perhaps it's better that families don't have to send children into the workplace if their income is supplemented, but wider economic questions around there would be a slight drop or loss kind of to the workforce. So how do we kind of consider those outcomes that are wider than perhaps the just main educational intervention, but may still have some kind of influence on it, but to a lesser kind of immediate degree? Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it did to me. Another question from me. So one of the things that you talked about, Emma, is the possibility of the evidence base growing, and potentially one of the interesting findings was around the gaps in the evidence base. What are the Durham team going to do to help make sure that the evidence portal is going to stay relevant as the research base grows?
Well, at first, I felt like I'd been given a terrible task because I felt like I would have to kind of report to my boss and say, oh, actually, we don't have a lot of LMIC research. We're kind of, doing this region a disservice. But of course, you can look at it from the other perspective, and it's actually a great opportunity to be able to collaborate with other partners like eBASE and also draw on other resources. So we really would like the kind of toolkit to be a living review that grows, because obviously, we have innovation in education all the time. So we are looking into kind of the idea that we could run automated searches through using applications such as Microsoft Academic, where if you use that kind of in combination with an online reviewing software like Epi Reviewer, you can then actually set up kind of algorithms that will draw in research that appears to be relevant. So it should speed up that process and hopefully capture a lot of kind of the research that perhaps we have missed. However, there are obviously kind of problems with accessibility. So the extent to which literature that is currently held within grey literature portals can be accessed. But I think that in turn, it kind of is a positive in a sense, because we can then engage in local partnerships with partners like eBASE and SUMA, which is our Latin America partner, where we can conduct more localized searches as well and ask fellows to start to kind of, develop their own contextualized databases, which we can then draw upon. So I think in future, it'll be more of kind of a globalized evidence network rather than just a toolkit for kind of the English practitioners in that sense.
Thanks, Sarah. And one of the specific questions we've got in the chat is around the cash transfers strand and the small impact in terms of attainment outcomes in that strand. I guess a question to both of you, did you find that surprising, and are there any kind of explanations as to why that might be the case?
Emma, you want to go?
I mean, it was a huge undertaking, possibly one of the largest reviews I've ever been involved in. The kind of spread of research in terms of setting, in terms of populations looked at, and in terms of research design, they were all highly variable. So it was very difficult to actually kind of get studies that were similar enough to obviously be meta-analysed, but at the same time different enough that we could look for differences that could be influenced by different factors. I think one of the issues is that in educational interventions, typically those that we include in the toolkit, so things like phonics interventions, as John touched on at the start, the teachers are more in control of those interactions. Yes, there can be wider things that happen kind of in the surrounding environment that pupils may be experiencing, for example, problems at home, but it really doesn't impact the intervention that much, because we can, within research, control the different variables that will influence outcomes from, let's say, a phonics intervention. And I think we can be more certain that the outcomes that we record and that we see are responsible for, kind of phonics. I think with cash transfers, it was very difficult for us to actually assess to what extent the cash transfer was responsible for producing observed outcomes, because they're not kind of, I mean, phonics is not a simple intervention by any stretch, but in comparison, cash transfers are aiming to do a multitude of different things, which I think is very hard to capture in just a single figure. And I also think there is some challenges around our inclusion criteria. So for us, the context in which the toolkit was created and kind of the stakeholder population that we serve here in the UK, we are very much focused on attainment. And perhaps with COVID that will change, and we will start looking at things more like attendance. But obviously in settings like in the Chad Basin, attendance is of more importance in a sense. We can't focus on attainment until we get the kids actually in school. So we lost a lot of studies because they were looking at things like rates of absenteeism, and our inclusion criteria were just focused on attainment and attendance. Obviously I can't really conflate the absenteeism with attendance. So we did lose a lot of studies from that respect. So I think that also may have possibly kind of pulled down our expected outcome. However, it was pleasing, as I said, that it was in line with other reviews and meta-analyses of the approach. So it wasn't too much of a shock, I suppose, or at least it was a relief to see that other people had found something similar.
I don't know if you would have something to speak to this, Emma, but what about the conditional and unconditional cash transfers? I don't know if there was any sub-analysis looking at conditional and unconditional cash transfers and the extent to which each actually goes to affect attainment.
Yes, there was a small difference, but again, I mean, it's a numbers game. Obviously, with meta-analysis, the more studies you have, the better. We were restricted to 26. So again, trying to kind of use that moderator analysis was very hard because it was just violating kind of, the statistical rules around how many studies you can actually use to create your effect. There was a small difference between conditional and unconditional. So we found that an unconditional transfer equates to about 1 month's worth of additional attainment, whereas if you attach conditions, that was 2 months. And then within that, and I kind of couch this in very kind of cautious terms, because I said our pool of studies is obviously getting smaller and smaller, but we did find that certain types of conditions led to higher outcomes in terms of attainment. So attendance conditions, I think, was plus 1 month. A health condition such as attendance at a clinic, which again, I, as an educational researcher, I would never have really considered even choosing to focus on. It was only through looking at other people's reviews of cash transfers who mentioned the importance of health conditions that actually would lead to plus 2 months attainment. But as I said, the problem is, given such a small pool of studies, you know, the kind of our confidence in those findings obviously gets smaller as well.
Okay. So, I think we've got time for at least one final question from the chat. So Melaine, you spoke a bit about the transferability tool and the considerations you've been making around transferability. Can you talk us through a bit about how long that process is from understanding and assessing the transferability of a topic from a high-income country to a low-income country?
I do think the process takes us as long as the entire project has taken, because it involves generally the stakeholder sessions and discussions across the different interventions of the various strands, and then also decisions with respect to the different variables that should be actually used to predict the transferability of the different interventions. And the robustness of the process within the stakeholder sessions to actually make a determination of whether an intervention is transferable or not. So it's a very lengthy and difficult process, but I do think it's a process that's worthwhile, given the fact that this tool will actually come a long way to reduce cost with respect to investments in interventions that are not necessarily relevant within our context, or the deployment of interventions and then later on realizing that this is not something that could be continued with. So it's as long as the entire project has taken, I do think, over 15 months.
Thanks, Melaine. And I think we've got time for one final question from the chat. So one of the things that you spoke about, Melaine, was about the different needs of stakeholders. To what extent were the needs of the policy stakeholders and the more practice-focused stakeholders like teachers or school leaders, to what extent were they different, and to what extent were they the same as you engaged in those stakeholder sessions?
I did across all stakeholders, policymakers, students, teachers, as well as parents. I do think the main difference particularly in different on strands that on strands that there was a bit of debate of its relevance and its contextual relevance and not being relevant. The main difference was between the teachers as well as the rest of the group as against the policymakers. And we did actually understand that, because for most of the policymakers, they are just there to make the policy decisions and not necessarily practitioners or researchers that actually explore the extent to which, or read about the extent to which different interventions actually affect educational attainment. So for most of these, we found teachers, parents, as well as students on one side and policymakers on the other. But with detailed explanation of how the different interventions work, how they are being deployed, we found more and more policymakers coming on the side of the rest of the group.
Thanks, Melaine. And thanks everyone for joining this session. Thank you particularly to Emma and Melaine. They've been an amazing team to work with across the project, and we're really happy with the evidence portal, which will be launching in the next couple of weeks. So please do look out for that. Thank you, CEDAW in particular, for funding this work, because we really hope it's going to make a big difference to practitioners and to policymakers in the Chad Basin. And yeah, I think finally, apologies for my various connection issues. Hopefully it hasn't impeded the session too much. And you'll be glad to know that the building I'm in has not burnt down and I have been allowed back into it. So thanks everyone. And I'll pass back to Marcella to end the session.
Thank you very much, John, Emma, Melaine. This was, as anticipated, a very informative session. Just a reminder for everybody online that the recording will be made available on SEDL's website in about a week's time, because we need to do the transcript as well. And also a gentle reminder to please complete the survey online before the session ends. You'll be redirected as soon as you close the meeting. And without any further ado, thank you very much to all of you once again, and see you back in December for our next webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.